Hello, can you hear me? Is that on? Yep. It's always very difficult to go last in a session and in a day because either there's nothing else to say or everybody's asleep or's left. So this is a difficult task. But what's been great about the other papers here is that there's been a lot of nuance and a lot of detail, and so I'm going to be very blunt in my comments and try and keep them brief because I'm sure you're all falling asleep. So basically what I want to first want to say thank you to Mawatan for inviting me here. I don't normally speak in Palestine. My research is for an external audience, largely because I feel like Jeremy, the language needs to be changed. We need to have researchers going and speaking to Western audiences mostly about what is happening here, that it's a colonization, that it's an occupation, that it's violent. So most of my research and interventions are abroad. So thank you to Mawatan, they persuaded me to come and speak. So I think, as I say, I'm going to keep my comments blunt. I think it's time to get real. I think Israel's going to annex the large settlements in the Jordan Valley with United States support. East Jerusalem will continue to undergo processes of Judaization, in inverted comma. Gaza will remain under house arrest. And the grim situation in Gaza could perhaps be a very bleak prophecy for the future of Palestinian enclaves in the West Bank. Donors will not voluntarily use economic or diplomatic pressure against Israel, either because of their own deep connections with Israel or because they want to suck up to the Americans. The generosity of donors is eroding. Palestinian Authority budget support declined by 50% since 2013, and there's been a sharp decline in aid since 2016. And there's a lack of alternative approaches. I call this no plan B. I recently did a lot of interviews with mostly Western donors, but some Arab donors also. And they still use the language of the two-state solution, of state building. And although they often talk about the window closing, the window's been closing really for, they've been talking about this window closing for the last 15 years. But they don't have an alternative approach, which in development terms is a travesty. In any other aid context, donors have a plan B. They don't have one here. So what will remain in this context? There'll be some humanitarian aid. There'll be security aid for sure. And there'll be modest aid for economic development. Now, all of this will be underpinned by an aggressive counter-terrorism agenda that restricts Palestinian political behavior. It's another layer of pacification techniques that complement Israel's more blunt, violent, and bureaucratic counterinsurgency operations. And stabilization's always been an underlying principle for aid here, but it's become absolutely dominant now. For American and many European Union donors, this is actually embedded in the language and practice. And we see this actually in the recent restrictions around the tightening and expansion of anti-terror certification systems. We see it around the issue of the Martyrs Fund. And we see it in the tightening and expansion of funds to NGOs who support the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. And donors will admit, if you push them far enough, that basically they're given aid for stabilization, awaiting a peace process that will produce a state. So there's a huge gap, as we know, everybody's talked about it here, I'm not telling you something you don't know. There's a huge gap between political rhetoric and political reality. Donors are still talking about statehood. Europeans, the UN, the Palestinian Authority are still using this language. Now, the Americans have smashed the kind of rhetorical consensus, if you like, on the two-state solution with their announcement of East Jerusalem as the Palestinian capital, and obviously all the withdrawal of aid and restrictions imposed on the Palestinian Authority. And we could say that this is maybe the final nail in the coffin. But actually, I think we need to date this, the final nail in the coffin, really back to 2012 and the failure of the Palestinian, what was called the 194 campaign for full membership of the United Nations. Sovereignty is an absolute principle. It cannot be earned. So if the Palestinians could not even get support then from these donors for sovereignty, then it's even less likely now, given Israel's increasing bilateral relations with more African and Asian states. They have had a charm offensive in Africa and Asia to get more support there. Now, if the PLO could not count on enough states to support its bid for sovereignty back then, I don't think it's going to get much support now. So, in the absence of sovereignty, can international aid and donors play a progressive role in what is clearly a situation of settler colonialism and apartheid? Now, others have outlined here that the current agenda of Western donors is highly negative. It's focused on stabilization. There's no challenge to the American agenda. The European donors are making some slight changes related to giving to funding to advocacy and legal NGOs, but this is referred to as being under the radar. They don't want to talk about it too much. And we heard from Jeremy about how the language doesn't actually define what the situation is here. Now, the Gulf Arab donors give a lot of aid here, but they're not really challenging this framework either. All the other donors are falling in behind the Americans as the dominant third-party actor. So it's really business as usual, despite some rhetorical dismay from some of the donors. So most donor aid funds are going to be dispersed in exchange for compliance with the status quo. And that's the status quo that's eroding further towards Israeli annexation and Bantustans. So what I'm going to try and propose now is, rather than to continue in the analysis of the aid agenda and how much it supports the occupation, I want to offer some demands that could form the basis for a new aid agenda. I'm completely cynical about this being adopted, but it's absolutely imperative for the Palestinian leadership and civil society actors to create their own set of demands. Perhaps some of the ones that I list here could form the basis for discussion. So first of all, we need to start off by asking, what is the broader purpose of aid here now? In a situation of settler colonialism, deep and possibly irreversible de-development, intensive fragmentation, Bantustanization, and an aggressive American counterinsurgency and counterterrorism agenda. So that's the first thing we need to get straight. The second thing we need to get straight is we cannot expect donors to act ethically. They either cannot or they will not. Now, some of the less belligerent donors and international agencies will continue to focus on humanitarian assistance, and now we see a discussion of resilience. What does resilience mean in this context? To kind of help Palestinian communities weather the storm. I think you've got your own concept for that. It's Samud, I thought. Now, as I say, some donors are doing some work under the radar in Area C and East Jerusalem, but the only picture they see is of an eroding development and governance context and less money. So this means that Palestinian political elites, and I'm sorry, like Bassam's just like completely rubbished them all, but Palestinian political elites and civil society organizations, the institutions that largely take donor money, they need to make decisions and create a framework on the conditions under which they are willing to accept donor money. If they do not, then this matrix of control and aid as counterinsurgency will continue. You will be smashed, controlled, neutralized. Now, some of the principles that could guide a new aid agenda is, firstly, only work with donors who do not operate with a counter-terrorism agenda in terms of their aid policies. Okay, that's the absolute bare minimum. Secondly, only work with donors who do not push anti-boycott, divestment and sanctions restrictions as part of their aid. Donors should not be allowed to interfere with Palestinian support for BDS. Thirdly, we need to shift the language and the reality away from security towards human development through support for local causes, particularly small-scale investment and local real estate. There should be less focus on macroeconomic indicators. Fourthly, a series of meetings should be convened. A series of meetings should be convened between MAS, the economic policy think tank, grassroots